So I'm going to start off by thinking a bit about how we might report and receive medication errors through the systems that we have in place at the moment. Moving on then to thinking about the analysis of medication errors and how that fits in with the current signal detection processes that we use in medicines at the moment. I can't really start talking about medication errors without at least a mention of definition. Although you've already heard about definitions previously yesterday, I think it's important to note when we're thinking about analysis of medication errors that different populations will have very different perceptions of what might be considered a medication error. I'm thinking in particular about the patient perspective, which may be very different to that we've defined in regulation. Thinking about how we ask a patient about medication errors, you should be able to see on the screen there, we've recently added, as a result of the changes in legislation, a question into our online reporting forms for adverse drug reactions around whether patients thought that a particular event was a medication error or i.e. related to unintentional error in prescription, dispensing or administration of the medicine. The aim of this is to capture structured data which we can then use for analysis further through the system. But in reality, we found that patients in particular are very keen to use this button because they perceive that any particular event that's caused them harm relates to a medication error in some form, rather than the sort of more regulatory definition that we use for instance, for signal detection. And also, we've actually found that they're much less keen to provide information on details on a particular medication error and why they perceived it to be so. I think really we need to work hard in this area to make sure that we are collecting the information that we require for analysis and to make sure that our message is clear to whichever stakeholder group that we're asking. The reason for thinking about definition is ultimately, in terms of analysis, to do with coding. We're absolutely reliant on coding for accurate signal detection of new safety issues from spontaneous data. And that collection process is very much an automated one. Particularly when we're thinking about high volumes of data, it's important that we can have some sort of structured way of identifying these particular reports. And clearly, medication error reports were slightly different to those which we're used to in terms of adverse drug reactions. It's also important to bear in mind that there's very much a global issue, and different cultures and different member states and different areas will have slightly different systems and slightly different perceptions of medication errors and the resulting outcomes from them. So, for instance, in some cultures, it may not be appropriate or may be very much frowned upon for a patient to be perceived to be complaining about the treatment that they've received. So I think really we need to think about whether there is a right question to ask when we're collecting this data, or whether it's flexible across different areas. But we need to have an appreciation at an analysis level as to what that actually means in terms of the issues we're identifying. And there may be local nuances that we need to be taking into consideration. Just thinking about spontaneous data, i.e. reporting systems that are in place for members of public, healthcare professionals to report when they believe that there is a particular event that has occurred. They really are an excellent source of information on real-life use of a product. In particular, patient reports offer an excellent overview of a patient experience taking a particular medicine. And this is obviously critical when considering medication errors and potential issues in terms of their use. But we are talking about high volumes of data. In the UK, we received around 26,000 reports last year, and of those, 80% were received electronically. The reason for receiving these reports electronically is to minimise the amount of coding that we have to do manually, and therefore to facilitate quicker analysis. But clearly, coming back to thinking about the questions we're asking, if we're automating the questions that go in, then we need to be sure that we're getting that right information and we're asking the right questions to the relevant groups up front. Frequently, signal detection for medicines has been used as drug event combinations to detect particular issues. And we need to think about whether that's actually useful for medication errors, or whether there are more areas to consider. You can see on the screen in front of you there an image of a yellow card, and you'll have heard some of the different types of medication errors through the sessions previously. But just to highlight that For instance, you can see in the middle of the screen there an area for drugs and reactions. But actually, medication errors may be picked up from patient details, from route of administration, from dosage, even from patient history. And actually, that information doesn't tend to be coded into reaction fields, certainly when we're receiving reports spontaneously. And although we may have coding conventions for pharmaceutical companies and for regulators to code, we actually need to be considering how we receive this information from those that matter, i.e. healthcare professionals and patients. I'm now going to go into a few slides on the overview of an example of a signal management process for detection of new safety issues. So going through the MHRA's signal evaluation process, there are a number of steps that you can see at the start around receipt, collection, and processing of all cases. And really, those are, as I've mentioned, aimed at minimizing the amount of data entry, making best use of automated systems, to enable us to focus our attentions on the analysis and signal detection steps. Following that receipt and processing, you can see that cases go into an assessment step where we might consider if we need to follow up further information, and into an aggregated signal detection system, which I'll come on to talk about in more detail later. Following that signal detection area, where we're looking for, say, potential events that haven't previously been understood to do with the medicine, or events that have changed in frequency, we may carry out an impact analysis and a further prioritization process as we carry out further evaluation. We may then, if we believe there is a potential issue, carry out risk-benefit evaluation and seek advice from expert committees, be that national committees initially, then moving on to European committees such as the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee. But clearly the important outcome of all of these steps is the regulatory action and the communication of it, such that we can ensure that relevant information is received to those who either need it in terms of prescription or in terms of patient use of a particular medicine. Thinking a bit about signal detection methodologies, there are a vast number of different approaches, from individual case review, which is very complicated when considering, or difficult at least, considering the volume of data that we're thinking about in this area. Thinking about disproportionality methods, that is where a drug event combination of interest is occurring more frequently for that particular drug than it is on average against the rest of the drugs on the database. And then criteria-based methods. So have we received over a certain threshold of numbers of reports? Have we received a particular type of seriousness indicators? Have we got a number of fatal reports? Are we looking at specific population groups of interest, such as pediatrics, the elderly population, or parent-child reports? And considering specific reaction terms of interest, at the MHRA we have a concept called alert terms, which is very similar to DMEs, designated medical events, that are used in the huge vigilance database, but wider terms that are considered particularly important when considering adverse drug reactions. Thinking about medication errors, are there terms that are important for us to be considering under that area, having already considered MEDRA options in this area? We largely use the top two methods on this slide to analyse these large data sets and to filter the highest priority cases. We're really focusing on detecting the issues of most importance from the data, and with the resources available, it's not actually possible to review every single case to a high degree of detail. So we're trying to filter out the most important issues. And we'll see from examples that there are many vast different types of medication errors that we need to be thinking about detecting. What happens to the data when we've received it? There are a whole range of different systems available at the MHRA. All of our data goes into a data analysis system that enables a whole range of different types of trend analysis to be carried out. You can see on there graphs for breakdown by gender, age, reported qualification, source, and frequency in terms of year, and also the associated disproportionality analysis for a particular product, with confidence intervals around how likely that event is to be associated with a particular product. Of course, it's impossible for us to detect medication errors if we don't have appropriate coding from this data. If we're thinking about these types of disproportionality analysis and these criteria-based methods, then we're only really focusing on drug event combinations. So it's critically important that one of the medication error terms is coded, as a particular drug event combination. At the MHRA, we use medication error as an alert term, which means it's always highlighted for review in our signal detection processes. But of course, there are many different medication error terms that we need to consider. We move on following our automated signal detection processes that highlight cases for review by our scientists and assessors. We go through a process of evaluation of that data, i.e. considering whether the event is already understood in product information or whether there might be a change in frequency. Are there any confounding factors such as patient history or other drugs? And what was the time to onset of the particular reaction? Is it biologically plausible that that drug caused that particular reaction? And ultimately, is it a signal? Is it a new safety issue where we need to be taking some form of regulatory action? Of course, I've mentioned we're reliant on coding. Sometimes coding of medication errors is very difficult. We received yellow card reports for related to headrin, stating that people's heads caught on fire. This isn't really a term that's available for us in MEDRA for coding. And what we've found is important in the signal evaluation process is not just the automated systems, but also having scientific review of data as it comes in to enable our actual coding to be reviewed and brought into signal evaluation processes if necessary. We can feed data into this signal management process from whatever step, whether it's further down the evaluation after it's automated or at other points during the process. Ultimately, after the data has been reviewed by our scientists and assessors, which occurs on a weekly basis at the MHRA, we'll be considering taking potential safety issues to one of our signal assessment meetings if further discussion is merited. We have 2 signal detections each week, one for established medicines and one for additional monitoring products, but all of those are attended by scientific and medical assessors from varying disciplines and varying areas of expertise. And reports for additionally monitored products are reviewed by a specific assessor who specialises in that particular area. We use our signal detection software in the meetings as an aid to assessment to enable us to look further into the cases. And should the meeting deem necessary that further evaluation can be carried out, it's carried out in that week. Our signal processes are set up such that we receive computed disproportionality scores on a Monday morning, and then we carry out that analysis, and completion of that initial phase of analysis will be by Thursday that week. We then move cases into the signal evaluation process, which occurs the Monday the following week. So it's actually a fairly rapid process, thinking about coding again. In terms of RPPS and impact analysis, RPPS is a regulatory pharmacovigilance prioritization system, which takes into account our agency obligations and public perceptions of a particular ADR. So, for instance, whether there's been any media interest, whether there's been interest from Parliament, and so on. Whereas impact analysis is a tool to prioritise potential actions and consider the strength of evidence with a number of different factors being considered. We identify a range of different issues through the analysis process, one of which been issues with fentanyl patches. Again, thinking about coding, we were receiving reports of use of fentanyl patches in hot baths, application of hairdryers to fentanyl patches to increase the use, increase the dose that's delivered, and even patients cutting the patches to try and get more fentanyl to come out of the patches. That causes coding issues, but also quite serious potential side effects detected through this issue. We're seeing fatal overdoses. We're seeing serious adverse events occurring as a result of these actions that are being taken. As a result of that analysis, we're considering the severity of particular cases. Regulatory action resulted in additional warnings that you can see on the screen being applied, being put put through the process. And this wouldn't have been possible without this prioritisation system to enable us to look at the most important particular cases. We may detect perhaps some less serious effects, but actually it's most important that we're focusing on these events that are having critical instances in healthcare systems. I mentioned that signals are discussed at a weekly signal management review meeting. Again, this is aimed to bring together expertise from across the agency in different areas. So that may be the scientists, the assessors, the medics that are carrying out that analysis, but it also needs to include our patient information teams. It needs to include the packaging, the leaflets. There's a whole range of different teams in the agency that need to be involved. And it really is a multifactorial analysis that we're carrying out at this stage. At this stage, we'll have fully evaluated the signals to consider biological plausibility and potential class effects. And actions would be discussed and endorsed, including recommendations for regulatory action to be fed into the European system. Thinking about the European system, again, it's important that we have a consistency from other member states, and therefore feeding into the PRAC process is again very much important for us. Of course, there are a range of regulatory actions that are available to us in terms of medication errors. You'll hear many examples throughout the day, and probably already have heard some of the ones that I've talked about. Of course, there's options to update packaging and labelling information, summaries of product characteristics and patient information leaflets, but also warnings in safety bulletins. But thinking about how we can make those warnings more accessible to healthcare professionals and patients. We can propose changes across the EU network and get a wider implementation of issues. But we have to think again about the different cultural issues in different member states and consider the impact in different areas of the changes that we make. Thinking about another example where different issues have been identified with the labelling of Repivax and Rivaxis. Two products, both authorised by the same company, originally had very similar packaging, and resulting in confusion about which product was given to different populations. This resulted in potentially Rivaxis being given to younger children, which meant that they missed the pertussis component of the preschool vaccination, and potentially didn't receive an equivalent diphtheria antitoxin response when compared to the recommended vaccines, according to the Green Book, ultimately resulting in a decreased protection to what they might be wanting and might be expecting. Clearly, this could manifest itself in different ways in the regulatory system that I've talked about. So we may receive reports of medication errors by those that were prescribing the medicines. I realised that I've given the wrong vaccine to a particular patient, but we may then start receiving reports way down the line of potential drug ineffective type reactions. So it's not just the case of looking for medication error terms at the point of issue. It's thinking further down the system about longer term effects of potential medication errors in this instance. I talked about communication earlier. We at the MHRA have a bulletin called Drug Safety Update. There's also information that goes available on the European agency websites. But we need to make sure that information is actually delivered to those that need it. We've put information about fentanyl patches and the issues that I've described already in patient information leaflets and on packaging. But we know that hasn't had a full hasn't totally resolved the issues. We still occasionally receive reports relating to fentanyl patches. We can do reminders in bulletins that are available for healthcare professionals, and we've recently done our first drug safety update bulletin targeted specifically at patients. But again, thinking about how we can deliver this information to patients, in particular in the most effective way, is very important. So just to summarise some of the key points that I've mentioned so far, our signal detection processes currently are very much reliant on accurate and consistent coding conventions. We are very much reliant on medication error terms being used in the cases. And yet we know that medication errors occur across the whole range of reports and areas of reports that we receive. So we need to think better about how we can improve the coding, or we can we can improve our signal detection systems to cope with those issues. We also may identify medication errors from very different sources, and we may receive slightly different information from those different groups. We may receive very factual information from healthcare professionals that may be related to either their administration or a patient's use of a medicine. We may then receive slightly different information about what a patient interprets from that data, or from that information that they've received, and what's actually happening in real life. To analyse medication errors effectively, we need different teams and organisations to work very closely together. I don't think we can say as a regulator that we have access to all of the information that we require to analyse medication errors. And even within our organisations, we require very much a cross-team approach in terms of analysis and progression of medication error issues. I think that's all I had to cover in the presentation, but happy to take any questions either now or afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Phil, for taking us through the signal management process so succinctly. And it was a nice follow-on to Sabine Brosh's presentation yesterday evening, placing an emphasis on coding and how we collect data and how we make the reporting systems accessible and as the basis for collecting the best quality data for analysis. Would anyone like to ask any immediate questions now or points for clarification? We will have time for a more general panel discussion at the end, but any immediate points for clarification? The colleague on the left, please. Could you state your name and affiliation, please?
Yeah, Ute Höfner, EUQPP for Novartis OTC. Thank you for your interesting examples. I'm particularly interested in the examples you provided concerning the patches and the pattern of misuse leading to medication error of patients, which obviously goes across different actives containing patches. Is there any guideline, signal detection under work, what to look at, how to analyze it? Because we experience with completely different patterns the same pattern, like using a fan for getting more active out of it, cutting the pieces in half, and having reactions like severe skin reactions and at end.
I think it's fair to say, I think it's fair to say that medication errors in terms of patches are difficult to evaluate. And actually, it's not just a problem with analysis of patches. It's across medication errors. We do see quite strange issues occurring, which are medication errors. And some of the things that I've mentioned are quite specific, quite odd issues around people cutting patches or around, you saw the Hedron example with people smoking and their hair catching fire. I think really we need to be, in a sense, you need to see individual cases, and those individual cases may spark particular analysis. But equally, we need to be able to power our systems such that we can pick those issues up without having to look at every single case, which is probably the challenge with medication errors.
No, but certain devices seem to have certain medication errors prone or built in, so that's what I'm heading for. And that would cry for a harmonized approach on the label, for example.
So it's an interesting point you raise in relation to learnings and principles that might be common in relation to the medication use process and also the design of medicinal products. David, would you like to comment? Do you have any perspective on that from the broader medication use perspective?
We often look at, it's like a class effect, but it's not a pharmacological class. So you get what you would think initially is a weird incident, and then you look into your data. Often we're looking at the no harm incidents as well, and you start to find across a way of presenting medicines, as in the case of patches. Generally out there, people think patches are innocuous and are not harmful, and when you start looking across patches, people are using them in a very sort of uncontrolled way. And we've been doing some work, because the message still hasn't got out there about patches, that both practitioners and patients think that they're far less potent and less, serious than having a tablet or an injection. And so, you pick up a beginning of a signal, and then you explore your data some more, and you are often surprised to find that there are a lot of other similar signals, but you have to have something to go on before you examine your data.
Very much. I think that perspective, that broader perspective than the strict product regulation focus is quite relevant there. Any other immediate comments?
Good morning. My name is Josie Dratwell from IPOPI. A few days ago, we had a presentation on the future of the EMA website and also using social media, etc., to a lot more effect. And I just wondered, when you said about medical alert bulletins, whether you know, the social networking or perhaps apps could be used to better effect.
I think it's absolutely important that we make use of social media, and it really, any communication method that's effective for getting information to different groups, and clearly social media has a particular option around patient engagement directly. We've at the MHRA recently been working on Twitter feeds and Facebook pages for yellow card reporting and for medical information that we've been working on. But I think it's certainly something that we can work much wider on, and indeed making reporting systems, as you mentioned, more widely available in terms of apps and the like. It will be important.